What were the main factors that you felt led to a change in governance of the museum service?
The current museum where we are now was an HLF. Well, it was a capital project which was funded by HLF, and as an ambitious scheme, the building was procured through an RIBA competition, and it was sort of large scale and delivered something which offered very good gallery space in terms of the environment and security, so we could show almost anything. So it was a big project. I suppose, like many others that took place in the late 1990s, early 2000. But as we moved into, well, the museum opened in 2002, and that first decade of the millennia, the funding situation changed, and there was much less money for museums. And indeed, as museums are just a service that don't have to be provided by the local authority. And as budgets became tighter, there's a tension clearly in what we wanted to do and develop the museum and what the local authority could offer. I think everyone will also appreciate that when you operate a museum or any arts organisation, you never reach a plateau where you say, okay, this is it. Of course, you need to be continually bringing in money and investment to change and to reinvent what you offer to bring things up to the moment. So drawing in that funding to improve what we were offering in the years after the museum opened became more and more difficult. So I think certainly for 3 or 4 years, it became inevitable that the museum might move down this particular route, and eventually that's what we did. So in 2013, the museum was transferred to management by a CIO. But it's very much not a case of a local authority saying, okay, well, here you go, you're on your own. It's absolutely was and is a joint venture. The reason that we were all happy to do this was that the local authority realised that if we took this particular path, we would be better able to bring in the funding from sources that the local authority couldn't access. So it meant that the museum could reinvent itself, bring in new funding and develop, bringing in sources from outside, make it much more simpler. Well, it's much simpler to do. So that was the reason, and we've remained close partners. Indeed, the museum wouldn't function without ongoing grant support from the local authority. So it's a partnership where they provide much of our revenue funding, and the trust is bringing in development funding to bring the capital projects which we are and have been involved with.
I think the main reasons for thinking about and considering a change in governance for the museum service were part of a much bigger picture. And we were looking at quite a transformational time for museums and arts services in the county of Hampshire and the city of Winchester. At around about 2010 is when it really all sort of started. Yes, we were working within a context of local authority austerity, and driven by the significant global economic changes in 2008. We were also impacted by a strategic realignment of national government funding as part of Renaissance in the regions. And so strategically, there was a moment, and I would say, yes, there are challenges, but it's also a moment and an opportunity to think about how we can continue to develop and care for the public value that museum collections and arts experiences have for local people going forward. So actually looking at changes in governance was part of a broader package, part of a broader programme of transformation. And finances were the primary driver for the catalyst, if you like, but there were a whole range of other things going on that meant that it made sense to consider a change in governance for the museums going forward. One of those was around actually greater collaboration, greater connectivity between other museum services and other arts organisations across the county and across the area. So there were conversations at early stages for Portsmouth and Southampton, Winchester and Hampshire together to kind of explore how to take forward delivering great public value for local people across the Hampshire and Solent region. It wasn't a cheap option to choose at the end of the day going forward into a cultural trust. The cheapest option for the local authorities concerned would have been actually just to cut the services, reduce the public funding to the services, and sort of look at other things. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to continue, both Hampshire and Winchester in particular, wanted to continue to develop the museums and arts provision within their area and for their communities. And the challenge that they had is that they could no longer afford to do that on their own. And they could no longer, I think it's probably better to say that the opportunities that opening up and extending the opportunity to support the running, the governance of those services into a wider community project just provided so many new opportunities for developing the service in creative new ways, inspiring the teams within the service to free them up to do things that perhaps they wanted to do for many years but just were not in a position to do so for understandable reasons within a local government sort of context. So I think the main factors were, yes, the catalyst was money. The second factor was a real ambition within the local authorities to continue to develop and improve the public value of the services. And I think a team that actually really had an appetite to be creative, to be innovative, and to take the journey to actually go into a new organisation that was much more working with a broader community than working as a local government, providing a series of services for a public community that it was increasingly less able to do because budgets were being reduced.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you found when you arrived and what the local authority expected you to do?
The community interest company essentially existed on paper. So the two local authorities that jointly own Gunnersbury had made this resolution to create a community interest company. They had, I understand, made a number of unsuccessful attempts to appoint a chief executive before I was successful. The delay in appointing me essentially meant that there was a skeleton team that the councils had employed, but they had no chief executive leadership, no leadership team. And so what I found essentially was, for want of a better term, two local authorities who were committed to a really innovative idea, but found it rather difficult to get that idea off the ground and implemented. It's interesting that that skeleton team that I found when I joined had actually been recruited by the local authorities. A couple of them were in fact local authority staff. And I think really what was most interesting was a sense of uncertainty within that staff team. They've been employed to launch a thing. That thing was theoretical. It was a company on paper, and they hadn't actually had anybody to really explain to them what the concept really meant. What is a community interest company, for starters? Because it certainly wasn't a common form of incorporation within the museum or heritage world. So I think one of my jobs initially was to actually try and flesh out what a community interest company is, its relevance to Gunnersbury, and then to quickly try and get the skeleton team to buy into that so that they actually knew what it was they were working for, because a lot of them still thought they were working for the council. And we had to really embark on quite a significant cultural kind of change program, because it is different working in the non-profit sector. So yeah, when I came, it was a little bit of a lot of theory, but not a great deal of practice.
Can you explain in detail the kinds of arrangements at Gunnersbury Estate, in particular the mechanics of the CIC?
Okay, so currently the Community Trust Company, and forgive me if I abbreviate, sometimes we call it the KIC, it's just easier that way. The KIC currently has a 25-year management contract jointly held with the London boroughs of Ealing and Hounslow. That 25-year contract is to run the museum service, and run Gunnersbury as a historic public park. So essentially we're a service provider, we're a contracted service provider. However, the CIC is a not-for-profit organisation, and so what we also have to recognise is that the fee that we're actually paid by the local authorities, and we are paid an annual fee for that service, is simply insufficient to cover both our day-to-day running costs, and certainly insufficient to cover any form of either investment in enhanced provision in the park or service enhancements. And so what we have to do is we have to earn additional monies. So what we find ourselves doing is we have to deliver the best service possible to the contract specification, which candidly is a little loose, and shall we say that gives us plenty of room to innovate. But we have to ensure that annually we are providing a service that the two councils feel is worth the fee they're paying. But we also have to behave like a business. So one of the things that we do, for example, is we actually hire out the park for commercial events, because we have to derive a commercial income. And to be honest, I think one of the things about the CIC is how do we maintain the right balance between being a service provider into the public sector with being an innovative business that runs commercial lines of income generation. And I think we're still trying to find that appropriate level of balance. An example would be we have contracted in the recent past, COVID notwithstanding, with some very large international commercial events companies who put on some very large pop concerts here. Now, some of our stakeholders, many of our visitors, and certainly a significant number of our neighbours, question why we were bringing 40,000 young people a day into their park to dance around and make a lot of noise and then go home in a slightly disorderly fashion. What has that got to do with running a museum service, a heritage service, and maintaining a public park? And the harsh reality is, without that income, we can't run the museum and heritage service in the park in the manner that I believe the community expects. There is a gap between the fee payment and the cost of running what we hope is an excellent service. And we have to plug that gap somehow. Whether we've got it right in the first couple of years of our operation, I'm open to discussion on that. I think possibly we went in a little too hard, a little too big, but ultimately, as we move forward, the CIC as a social enterprise has to have a business line running in parallel with its service delivery. And I think, for me, that doesn't make us unique at all. You know, I'm sure many museums across the country are facing this issue, but I think for us, it is absolutely front and centre that the form of incorporation as a community interest company rather than a charitable trust, for example, places that commerciality really quite front and centre for us. And I think there was possibly not quite the realisation on the part of the local authorities or other stakeholders how hard we'd have to work the commercial side of things. I think that's emerging now. And part of it is presentation. we need to be clear that we are a community interest company. So any of the commercial activity we actually generate is for the benefit of the community. And I think perhaps we weren't as good at communicating the reason why we were hosting 40,000 ravers a day. And I think we just need to get better at that. We just need to get better at communicating that there is a balance here. And it's a work in progress.